Welcome back. This is week 13, lecture 1, the Peace of Augsburg and the End of Christendom. We're rapidly nearing the end of the course. And so all of what we've been doing thus far up to this point and for the remainder of the course, I hope will be tied all together to give you a good basis for writing a very exciting final examination that I'm very much looking forward for you guys to read from all of you. We've been talking about different patterns of Reformation, and the previous lectures of last week dealt with the English Reformation, Reformation in England, and the Radical Reformation. Before that, we did the Reformation of the refugees, dealing with the Calvin and his consistent focus on trying to evangelize France, even as he was based in Geneva, and then the spread of the French refugees fleeing to Geneva and then also going to England, the influence of John Knox, who thought Geneva was the most godly city he'd ever seen, as a basis for bringing Calvinist theology and church principles to Scotland. And we're going to be continuing with that this week with the Catholic Reformation, or the Counter Catholic Reformation. I'll be addressing that in the second lecture for this week. But here I wanted to go back a bit more chronologically, even though there has been a chronological progression, if you've noticed. And because look at the Radical Reformation starting in the 20s and culminating in the 30s. The English Reformation just gets started in the 30s, and then the Reformation of the refugees also is just getting started in the 30s and on into the 40s. And so during this period, as these areas are developing with England and France, Geneva, the spreading of Calvinism, I'm going to go back and look at kind of where we kind of started, not in terms of the late medieval Reformation. That'll be for next week when we do the Catholic Reformation. But looking back towards what was happening within the empire, within the Luther's Reformation, so to speak, the evangelical princes. And to do that, we're going to start back and go back to with the Confession of Augsburg. Even though we've talked about it already, it was the assigned reading for week 9, so you've already read it. And so part of this presentation, at least as a starting point for approaching the theme for this lecture, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, is to start with the Confession of Augsburg. So I hope that kind of sets the scene of what I'm trying to do here. In any case, and with that kind of set, we'll move on then to the first slide, Confession of Augsburg and preparing for war. Now, as I said, you haven't read the Confession of Augsburg, and I talked about it previously. It was both a religious theological document and very much a political document. I've already mentioned that the term Protestant was first used at the Deed of Speyer in 1529, and a number of evangelical princes and imperial cities refused to enforce the Edict of Worms. The Edict of Worms condemning Luther. The Emperor Charles V. They refused, and they walked out. They protested, and therefore became known as Protestants. And so from 1529 on, we can talk about the Protestant princes within the empire in a specific sense. And then in a more general sense, we can refer to Protestants as those territories and individuals who sought independence from Rome, whether that be part of the Radical Reformation or the Reformation of the refugees, or then with England, it's a bit more problematic with the Henrician Reformation, which did proclaim independence from Rome, but yet under Henry was still very much a Catholic theology and ritual in terms of the liturgy and the Mass and everything else. But with Edward, it moves towards being Protestant. So I just want to be clear in terms of the terms we use to describe the events, because that is essential for understanding the events, because the terms we use condition our understanding. So we need to analyze them and ask, what is the historical basis for these terms that we use to describe what is signified by the extant evidence. That's really what it comes down to. What is the basis for making statements about what we call the Reformation, or about the past as such? But that gets into other issues that are not necessarily directly a topic for this course. So now we go back to one of these documents, the Confession of Augsburg, and it was put together primarily by Melanchthon and a number of other Protestant theologians from Wittenberg, or from electoral Saxony, and the other signatories to the Confession of Augsburg, Philip of Hesse. I think I had already mentioned some of the other princes. Elector John, Frederick the Wise had died by this time, had signed on to it. So it was first Elector John and John Friedrich, the successors of Frederick, son, and I don't remember if his son and grandson or just two different sons. Anyway, my apologies for that. But they were certainly signing on for the Elector of Saxony, electoral Saxony. And they knew that this was presenting to Charles a document trying to persuade him of the legitimacy of their position. And I can't stress enough the indistinguishable relationship between theology, religion, and politics at this time, and as it always had been. That breaking those three components apart is very much a modern construct, even though we certainly can point to distinctions between religion and theology, not only in the 16th century, but also always before. I think I've addressed those terms. But politically, it's all one and the same. It has to be one and the same. And that, for Charles, was the overriding ideal of his rule. This concept of I am the Christian emperor of Christendom, divinely appointed by God. There can only be one faith. We can't have a plurality. Yes, we tolerate the Jews because they're similar, but we don't necessarily accept them all that much. But we deal with them. But within Christendom, it can only be one confession. And of course, before the Confession of Augsburg, there were no such things, strictly speaking, as confessions. So Charles, on the one side, is at least allowing the Protestants to present their case. There's certainly the national, quote-unquote, national issues involved in terms of wanting to take care of this German problem on German territory and lands, not just simply handing Luther over, even though that was what the Edict of Worms was all about. Charles had been open to putting it before a general council of the church. And that is something that the Protestants, the evangelicals, the Protestants, were open to as well. There were problems with that for both sides. For Charles, it was almost saying, okay, well, if we do that, that means, number one, it goes outside of Germany, most likely. It's thoroughly in the papal court. And how do we deal with that? The political struggles between the Pope and the Emperor, which had been there all along throughout medieval Christendom. And for the Protestants, it was like, if we actually do accept the judgment of a general council, that means we're accepting the supremacy of the Pope, and we're not willing to do that. Now, for the Pope, it also was problematic, because saying that a council would be legitimate meant that is almost harkening back to conciliarism, the Council of Constance with Haec Sancta and Frequens, whereby the papacy is underneath the authority of the council. So the Pope was very reluctant to assert a council, even as that was increasingly being called for by Protestants and Catholics alike. And interestingly enough, this goes a little bit beyond the 1530 issue. Um, Catholic calls for a council kept coming and becoming increasingly um, fierce. And Pope Paul III almost pulled it off. Pope Paul III was a reforming pope. He was very much open to reform. And that is where this distinction between reform and reformation also comes into play, because there were certainly significant Catholic factions that were very open for reform, demanding reform, seeing the need for it, and yet not willing to go so far as reformation. Council was eventually called in 1545. I'll come back to that a little bit later today, and certainly next week. Not next week, but in the second lecture for this week. So we have this problem, this political problem in Augsburg. Melanchthon is trying to formulate a document that might have a chance of being recognized and offered and maybe even dealt with by the emperor in the Catholic side. He's tweaking it. Luther, of course, cannot be at Augsburg because that was outside of electoral Saxony and say Protestant territory, which is still inchoate at this time. It's a protest at Speyer, but there wasn't, let's say, necessarily this concept of Protestants as such. So he had to let Melanchthon take care of it. And Melanchthon did. And they go to Augsburg. A party goes to Augsburg. Luther stayed not in Wittenberg, but as close to Augsburg as he could get. And so, without actually being there, Württemberg is where he actually was. So it's a tense situation, and Charles is going to be there at Augsburg. Charles had finally had the leisure to deal with the religious problem in Germany. I think I mentioned after the Diet of Worms in 1521, he had to deal with not only Francis, but then threats from the Turk, which were still present and was playing a factor, and will play a factor today as we see the developments going on. But also with the Pope. And so by 1530, he had not really made up, but there was a rapprochement with Francis. And he had also had kind of settled things with the Pope after the sack of Rome in 1527. Of course, which was also when the Pope denied Henry VIII's petition for an annulment in that context. And so Charles finally has the time to say, okay, let's deal with this problem once and for all. This religious problem. Let's see what they got. And let's try to figure something out here. Okay. So they're working now. Charles also calls his Catholic theologians from the Catholic estates, Catholic principalities that were remaining loyal to Charles and to Rome. And they had an advanced draft of the confession, and they wrote up a series of, I think it was 404 articles refuting it, proclaiming it to be heretical. They went pretty extreme. So, in Melanchthon, having gotten some sort of information about these articles, started to try to address and reformulate some of the statements while keeping the essentials. And Charles even felt that these 404 articles were too much. And so he turned it to Johannes Eck, who had debated with Luther before. And Eck has gotten a lot of bad press because Luther just really attacked him viciously, calling him names and everything else. But Eck was a brilliant theologian. And we can't accept Luther's critique and indeed denigrating as the actual reality of Johannes Eck. And Eck wrote up a refutation, a confutation of the Augsburg Confession, or at least one of the drafts of the Augsburg Confession. And that too was presented then at the Diet. So when they all got together, they had, the Augsburg Confession had gone through several drafts. Melanchthon presents it. Eck presents his refutation. interestingly enough, Charles did not allow Melanchthon or the evangelicals to have a copy of X refutation, but just asked whether they would acknowledge they had been refuted. Melanchthon had taken notes because the X confutation was read before the Diet. Melanchthon took notes and then ended up writing an apology for the Augsburg Confession. And again, an apology, not in the sense of, oh, I'm sorry, but in the sense of, here is my answer, my response to this so-called refutation. So it's very much an assertion of the position. And he does, again, say that there's some wiggle room, so to speak, but there are essentials that we cannot give up. And this concept, the distinction between what is essential and what is non-essential. And in Greek, what is non-essential was called the adiaphora, the A-I-D. I'm not going to spell it. I'm not going to spell it in Greek. Adiaphoric. And this became a serious problem for the Lutherans later on after Luther's death, because what constitutes a non-essential and what constitutes an essential? And even Luther, in reading the Confession of Augsburg, said it was absolutely perfect. He said, Melanchthon has done a brilliant job. He says, even if Luther said, I have nothing to add, and if I did, it wouldn't help anyway. He said, I would not have stepped so lightly. So Luther would have been more bombastic, more polemical. And Melanchthon was trying to be diplomatic, trying to find a way to present the essentials Protestant position without giving up anything or without giving up anything that was really essential. So presenting it and saying, okay, there's some things we might be able to work out, but these things are essential. Charles just accepted X position and proclaimed the Confession of Augsburg to have been refuted, and then tensions were running high because now, not only after Speyer in 1529, but now it was very clear that the official imperial position, the official position of Charles, was that the Edict of Worms must be enforced. Period. The case closed. Open rebellion. Therefore, the evangelical states, principalities, realize that they are now in open rebellion against the emperor. And they formed the League of Schmalkalden in 1531 as a defense league to provide common defense against the emperor. Now, that is the tension of Augsburg. It's not just a religious document or a theological document. It is a political document for rebellion against the emperor on both sides. So, what do we deal with? How we deal with this? The tensions, as I said, were rising after Augsburg, 1530. And the Protestant estates had to realize not only do we need to form this defense league, we also have to justify it. What is the right to resist or rebel against the emperor? Now, this had been argued before in medieval Christendom. John of Salisbury, a 12th century scholar in Paris, wrote a treatise on the right to resist tyrants. Obviously, there were biblical basis for it, but yet also biblical basis not for the right to resist. But it really caused a problem, and we'll see next week in the dealing with the French Wars of Religion. It was a major problem for the French as well, and for the Huguenots as well, because it's a major issue. It's one thing just to disagree; it's another thing to be in open rebellion. Just think about that for a moment. It's one thing to protest; it's another thing to rebel. And that's what we're facing the Protestants. They felt we cannot go along with this. Number two, we are two princes. We are two, the powers that be and are ordained of God. And we have to look out for our people, for the people within our territories. We have to protect them. It's our responsibility to do so. And to concede to the emperor would be reneging on essentially our vow to protect our people in this way. So this debate was both theoretical as well as then practical, as the League of Schmalkalden is organizing and mobilizing, because they're fearing war and they know it's there. And from this point on, the League of Schmalkalden and the Confession of Augsburg becomes the basis for Protestantism within the empire, for the evangelical position. And it's going to spread. And it's going to be spread by the force of the League of Schmalkalden, which was not simply a defense league in terms of, we'll just sit back and wait till we're attacked. It's also actively going out and gaining territory. Now, I discussed this in Luther and the Reformation in the later Middle Ages with the case of Hildesheim, which I first kind of introduced early on, I think chapter 1, and then get back to in chapter 8, I believe it is, the last chapter, when I go into the details about how Hildesheim became quote-unquote Protestant. And so that's kind of the context behind some of this, not just that example, because that example is just one example. There are many different examples. And that is this political, military, theological basis for the conflict with the emperor in Germany. Problem was, though, as the League of Schmalkalden starts to gain more members, there is renewed problems on the borders of the empire with the Turks. And Charles has to go again to figure out how to defend Christendom against the Turks, and he realizes, I can't do this without the Protestant princes. So in 1532, there was something called the Nuremberg Standstill, which was, let's say, a ceasefire treaty, even though no shots had been fired in that sense quite yet. But it was a truce to say, okay, we'll call a truce right now. We're not going to make any changes right now because we need to kind of come together and try to deal with the threat of the Turk on the borders. That lasted for quite a while. Again, so Charles still was concerned with international politics. Shortly after this time, England, in Charles's view, falls away with the Act of Supremacy. So he has a host of problems on his plate. And it's like, okay, I need the support. So we'll call a truce. We'll get back to this issue. The Nuremberg Standstill then was reissued for a period of basically 15 years. During which time, the League of Schmalkalden was not simply sitting on its thumbs. It was seeking more adherence, more support. New cities were turning Protestant. Again, Hildesheim fits into that pattern, even though it's a little bit later, but they do. And also they said, okay, we still have this problem of the Swiss. Zwingli had died at the Battle of Kappel at 1531. He was fighting. This was a battle between the Swiss cantons. He died. But before he did, he presented his own confession of faith to the Diet of Augsburg in 1530. And then four Swiss cities, well, Strasbourg was not really Swiss, but Strasbourg, Constance, Memmingen, and another one wasn't certain. May have been Basel. Presented what's called the Confession of the Four Cities, the Confessio Tetrapolitana. And they presented their confession to the Diet as well. The Diet, led by Charles, didn't deal with those whatsoever. Didn't read Zwingli's, didn't read the Four Cities confessions. That wasn't even an issue for him. And remember, back in 1529 at the colloquy of Marburg, Philip of Hesse wanted to get Luther and Zwingli together so there could be a common Protestant front against the emperor. It was the doctrine of the Eucharist that prevented that, because Luther stuck to his understanding of the real physical presence within the elements, in with and under the presence of the bread and the wine of Christ's body and blood. And Zwingli said, "Oh, so there that." Was, let's say, a split within the Protestant camp, if we look at the broader picture of such. Because Switzerland is in southwest Germany, they're very close. That's what the Forest City, Strasbourg, is very close there too. And so, how can we kind of try to get a rapprochement now too that Zwingli's gone? And that led to what's called the Wittenberg Concord in 1536. And the Wittenberg Concord was an agreement between the Swiss cities and the Lutheran cities. It wasn't a complete union, but they moved far closer together than they ever had before. And with Zwingli gone, this Wittenberg Concord made possible the Swiss cities to join the League of Schmalkalden. So all of a sudden, the League of Schmalkalden becomes pretty powerful indeed. Pretty powerful indeed. And if we go to the next slide from after the Schmalkaldic Wars, which we'll come back to, but to the map there, you see the history prologue to war from History in 5. This is, Googling map during the Schmalkaldic Wars. But just to kind of get a sense of the different camps here we have within the empire, I think you can see it decently enough. The Protestant territories are in pink. The Catholic territories are in kind of greenish blue or so. And then you can see Augsburg kind of right between, because it's kind of not sure what camp it's going to be adhering to. But the keys down there, Württemberg, that's where Luther stayed during the Diet of Augsburg. The Palatinate is there, but that's where Cologne is, and then Hesse, where Philip of Hesse was, and then Electoral Saxony. The HS, that designation, is the Duchy of Saxony, and then we have Bohemia and Bavaria. And so, some ways, based on this map, it's not quite that much. The Protestant estates were as numerous as were the Catholic states within the empire. So it's that level of rebellion that is going on. Now, this map too is good because it shows, continued problems with France, continued problems with the Ottoman Empire or the Turks, continued problems with the Pope, and what do we do about it all, and how do we manage this political division within the empire that is still based on religious confession, theological confession, which then broke into armed conflict in 1547. Now, I think in the past I've talked about in previous lectures, the Civil War, period of Civil War from 1531 to 1555 within the empire. Most of that time is so-called Cold War, not actual battles between imperial armies and the League of Schmalkalden are taking place, but it's extremely tense, and it's not a do-nothing kind of strategies on both sides, and the League is expanding and preparing, but it becomes this very fierce Cold War, becomes a hot war in 1547, where the forces do clash on the battlefield. And Charles emerged victorious. In April of 1547, the Battle of Mühlberg, Charles achieved a decisive, or not, depending on what we mean by decisive, a significant victory. He captured John Friedrich, the Elector of Saxony. He captured Philip of Hesse, and after another almost year of fighting, it was said, okay, this is enough. What do we do about this without the leaders? It's kind of important. And if you look at the dates too, 1547, 48, 1547, Luther had died in 1546. So Luther had just died. Who was going to lead the movement that Luther had started? Who was going to speak for the Lutheran position? Uh, Obviously, one major candidate was Melanchthon, Philip Melanchthon, who had been Luther's right-hand man all along. But another candidate had emerged, Nicholas von Almsdorf, who had been a student of Luther's, had studied with Luther all along. And Melanchthon continued, let's say, the attempt to find a way to diplomatically deal with the Catholics. And here's the real issue. It's called the adiaphora, again, which I mentioned, the non-essentials. And it became a major conflict within the Lutheran camp and was to eventually split the Lutheran camp into two factions. But at this time, there's just tensions. It hasn't split yet. But the tensions between von Amsdorf, which was a rigid interpretation of Luther's positions, and Melanchthon's attempt to be somewhat conciliatory interpretation of Luther's positions, was causing tension as well. And with his victory and his capture of John Friedrich and Philip of Hesse, Charles had the upper hand. And so in 1548, um, he issues a document known as the Interim. Says, okay, the Interim of 1548. It's called an interim because it was going to be the solution pending the outcome of the Council of Trent. A church council was finally called in 1545, the year before Luther died. A general council of the church, the Council of Trent. I'll be talking a lot more about Trent in the next lecture for this week. But here's important because Luther, Charles said that we need to wait for the Council of Trent to complete its business before a final solution can be imposed. The interim was not like the Nuremberg standstill. It was not a truce. It was saying, okay, what we will allow at this point is one, the so-called Protestant territories can continue having married clergy. That's one concession. They can continue celebrating Mass and giving communion in both kinds to the laity. And a formula of the doctrine of justification that was could be agreed upon and was agreed upon could be the basis for those Protestant territories. But in all other respects, in terms of returning to the Mass in Latin, in terms of the Eucharist as a sacrifice, and all other Catholic doctrine and religious practices were to be reinstituted. It was not really a compromise. Certainly, depending on your position, you viewed it in different ways. Charles felt, okay, it seems to me that these are the big issues, the married clergy and communion of both kinds and justification. Fine, we can deal with that. So here you go. Here are your essentials. For von Amsdorf and for many of the Lutheran territories, it's like absolutely not. There are far more essentials than these three. Melanchthon was some in between. He said, okay, there are more essentials than these three, the Mass being one. But how far can we go, and how far can we really understand and maybe interpret the Mass in a different way, even if we use the same formula for celebrating it? It's one of these issues of how far can we go to appease the emperor now that we have he has this kind of in a noose almost. How far can we go? And that too just made this tension and split between the von Amsdorf faction of Lutherans and the Melanchthonian faction, and they even received names. Melanchthon's and his followers were termed the Philippists, after Philip Melanchthon, but as a name for the group, the Philippists. And von Amsdorf and his group were known as the Gnesio-Lutherans, Gnesio, as the original Lutherans. So this is also an issue of a battle and debate between Luther's heritage, and who was going to stand as the leader after Luther. Was it the original Lutherans, or was it then the Philippists? And the original Lutherans viewed the Philippists as, crypto Catholics almost. Um, and it's like, what do we do about this? And also, funnily enough, crypto Calvinists, because of the doctrine of the Eucharist. Melanchthon was willing to go more towards the symbolic understanding too. But it's like, how do we handle these problems? And this split was just continue within the Lutheran territories on until the 17th century, and further splits came about as well. Um, and a good friend of mine, Robert Christman, at Luther College in Iowa, um, wrote his dissertation on the early 17th century split within certain Protestant territories in the empire over the doctrine of original sin, and whether or not the doctrine of original sin was a substance or an accident of human nature. Um, in some ways, very similar to the doctrine of the Eucharist. I think I talked about transubstantiation, and that this is an Aristotelian distinction. And even if they had moved away, certainly, and even Luther did not accept transubstantiation, that Aristotelian distinction was still there. So the question is, original sin, is that part of human nature, human substance, or is it as an accident of human nature? And that debate between the substantivists and the accidentalists was debated not only in universities and among theologians, it was also debated and argued and fought over in bars and pubs on the local level, even if they didn't really understand what they were fighting for. So, like, well, are you a substantivist? No, I'm an accidentalist. Oh, fighting, breaking out. So it can be this tense. It's not just a theoretical idea or an individual choice or anything else. It is a central issue of your individual understanding of yourself and your public understanding of yourself and of the community and of the state. Politics, theology, and religion are all one and the same. In that context, that's just kind of jumping ahead a bit, and I'm not going to be addressing that debate over original sin in the 17th century in this course. Was the problems of the interim and how to deal with it. No one liked it. Actually, the Catholics didn't like it either, because it's like, my God, they're getting away with murder here. How can we allow this to happen? And the Protestants are saying this is cutting out and gutting essential positions, essential doctrines based on the Confession of Augsburg. It's cutting back the Confession of Augsburg to not the essentials, but to only 3 measly little points. And even though the doctrine of justification is so important, I'm not so sure we're going to accept the formulation that we're given. And we'll talk more about that in the next lecture too. Because one of the first decrees issued by Trent, the Council of Trent, was a decree on justification. And I'll be reading that, or parts of that, to you next week, or not next week, excuse me, in the second lecture for this week, in the next lecture. So the interim was almost universally hated. It was an interim until Trent would definitively settle things in Charles' views. But Trent took a long time. And things within the empire were getting more problematic. And it could not be sustained, the interim. That's why I have it here, the Deed of Augsburg in 1555, the failure of the interim. And here, too, we come to the problem, once again, of the appeal to a general council. The appeal to the general council on all sides. Charles had imposed this interim militarily, by force, appealed it by force, claiming that we'll wait for Trent to do its job, and when it's finished, then that will be the final solution. The Protestants are still calling for a general council. They weren't satisfied with Trent. Some of them were invited to Trent, but they said there's no way we're going to go to Trent, nor are we going to accept the decrees of the Council of Trent. That would be tantamount to accepting the authority and supremacy of the Pope, and that we're not going to do. Charles, too, was like, yeah, it's a problem, an issue. Um, I'm head of Christendom. If I kind of say, well, the Pope has the last word, that's kind of problematic. I mentioned Paul III as a pope who was interested in reform. Well, his successor, Paul IV, who finally did call the Council of Trent in 1545, was absolutely not interested in reform, or not much. Certainly, there could be some reform. Getting the church in order. Was more interested in shoring up his own household, so to speak. I'm not talking about his personal retinue or the Vatican's court or the papal court, but in terms of the Catholic position. And he was not going to listen to any kind of a compromise, basically. We'll talk more about this again next lecture. And so it put everyone in a very tense situation. Charles has kind of reached the end of his ropes. He's not sure what to do. Charles had one brother, his brother Ferdinand, and he had one son, Philip. Philip had become king of Spain. Ferdinand was the ruler of the Habsburgs family territory in Austria. And so Charles is like, what do we do? Well, I really can't do this anymore, and I'm going to abdicate because I do not see a solution. I have failed. But before he finally does, he has to deal with the tensions and problems with his succession. What he proposed, and what actually came about, was that Ferdinand would receive the title of emperor. Philip II would be king of Spain, and also the Low Countries, which were Charles's had from his mother. We talk about the Spanish Netherlands in the 17th century. That's all coming out of this agreement. And also that Philip then would marry Mary Tudor. Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, as we know, had recently come to the throne. Ferdinand said, no, Philip shouldn't marry Mary. My son Maximilian should marry Mary. And so I should be the one. My family, my side of the family, should be the one to inherit the joint English Habsburg union. Philip didn't really support Ferdinand. Ferdinand didn't support Philip, and consequently, neither of them really supported their father. And Philip, finally, Charles just said, okay, this is the way it's going to be. And called the Diet of Augsburg, another diet within the empire, to make these arrangements. And I will abdicate. At the Diet of Augsburg, the solution to the problems within the empire, to the political and theological and religious problems within the empire, was, again, a compromise, but one that did not enforce a compromise on everyone, but allowed the territorial prince to determine the religious confession. I have up there then the quotation, where there is one ruler, there should be only one religion. Ubi unus dominus, ibi unus et religio. Now that is a formulation at the Diet of Augsburg. That becomes, I can't really say, abbreviated, or is in a more succinct version that doesn't appear till about 1600, but becomes the most well-known version, is cuius regio, eius religio. Whose the reign is the religion. So that the Protestant territories could remain Protestant. The Catholic territories could remain Catholic, based on the prince. This was not religious toleration. It's not even religious pluralism. It was accepting two distinct religious confessions within the empire. Charles was, again, devastated. He had completely failed. And abdicates and retires to a monastery. And I've said before, Charles was the last medieval emperor. I think he was, because he still had this ideal. It was that ideal that he had striven to realize, that he had fought for, and that he had hoped to affect and bring about. And he had been shocked the whole time. Almost his whole reign was riddled with events that undermined that ideal. From the outbreak of the problems with Luther, as Charles was crowned emperor in 1519, to the wars with France, which as such, there have been wars among Christian princes all along, so that's as such wasn't that much, but the duplicity of Francis the First of France, remember, called first early modern monarch, realpolitik, which I'll come back to, and his alliance, Francis making an alliance with Suleiman, the leaders of the Turks of the Ottoman Empire. How could that be? A Christian prince allying with an infidel against the emperor? And how could the Pope side with Francis against the emperor? It's like Charles is like, what do we do about all of this? And now finally, it's like, I can't do this. It's gone too far. No one's really, I mean, he wasn't a whiner. Charles was not a whiner. But I love whining, actually. If I can put myself in Charles's position, it's more like, why has it gotten to this? The Pope, I agree with the Pope. I'm on the Pope's side, but the Pope works against me. All these princes within the empire are working against me. France is a mess. England is a mess. Even though hopefully by now, until this is before Mary dies, we'll be able to work things out. So there's maybe hope for the future in that, on a family dynastic basis for the Habsburgs. This idea of Christendom has failed. It has failed. Now I have it there after his abdication, the beginning of the lack of toleration in state churches. If I were going to ask another question for the final exam, even though this one could be part of the revolution question, it might very well be, to what extent did the Reformation bring about toleration? To what did it bring about increased repression? But I don't think I would ask that question. Why? Because in my view, there's no way at all we can really see the Reformation as bringing about religious freedom and toleration. There are hints here and there. I think I mentioned when Calvin in Geneva burned Michael Servetus for heresy, Sebastian Castellio retorted that to burn a man is not to defend a doctrine, it is simply to burn a man. That is a hint of quote-unquote toleration. But that was far, far in the minority. Within the territories, within the individual principalities, there was no toleration. If you were just a common person, if you were an artisan, if you were a merchant, you didn't have a choice. You had to accept the religion of your prince. If you didn't like it, you could move. That worked for Protestant territories as well as for Catholic territories. So if you were living in a Protestant territory and you were Catholic, you had to leave and move to a Catholic territory. Now, if we go back to this idea of not just the emperor, but princes being part of the powers that be that are ordained of God and responsible for the religious and spiritual as well as the physical well-being of their subjects. In this heightened, tense situation with Augsburg, 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, as it's called, you want to make sure that your territory is not being infiltrated by heresy. And for the Lutherans, followers of the Confession of Augsburg, the Catholics were the same, basically, as heretics. They're not technically heretics, they're superstitious, they're wrong, and everything else. For the Catholics, the Lutherans are definitely heretics and schismatics. So, if you want to enforce that, you have to start developing administrative means to do so. And I'll be talking about that process, a process that has been known as confessionalization or confessionalism. Even scholars have referred to the second half of the 16th century on to the 16th, 17th century a little bit as the age of confessionalism. To enforce a particular religious confession. With an empire, it was one of two. It was the Confession of Augsburg, 1530, and evangelical principles, or it was to be the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent closed up shop with his job well done in 1563. I'll be talking more about Trent in the next lecture. But this is not toleration. It's not toleration. It's just at this time, too, that the witch hunts are really beginning to take off. Both Catholics and Protestants burned witches. Protestants burned more witches than Catholics did. And why? Because witches were those vast majority were women. Vast majority were widows, unattached women. There were male witches too, but the majority were women who didn't conform, who were seen, I'm not saying what they were doing, who were seen as not conforming, not fitting in, as deviant. That fear of deviance was far broader than the witch trials. It is the basis of confessionalization and the building of state churches. I've talked about state churches before. We look towards the, back to Rome. And the imperial position throughout medieval Christendom was usually more or less advocating for a state church rather than a church-state view. Marsilius of Padua in 1324, with his Defensa Pacis, explicitly argues for a state church. Not with that term, but the clergy work for the emperor. They're a function, just like garbage collectors. But that is what emerges within the empire between these two confessions. We have to make sure that our territory is safe. Again, I'll be talking about this not in the second lecture, but next week, truly next week, in terms of confessionalization and the growth of bureaucracy and the bureaucratic state. It wasn't necessarily a pretty picture. It was not toleration. It was not plurality. It was enforced conformity. Regardless of what you might think of the validity of the theological positions, it was not toleration. You were allowed to follow. That was Luther's position. As long as you agree with me and believe what I believe and say, you're fine. If you don't, You're one of the Schwärmer. You're one of the people who I will, attack. You're even worse than the papists. You'll also notice Confession of Augsburg, or Peace of Augsburg. There's no mention of any other religious confession. The Four Cities Confession, Tetrapolitana Confession is not mentioned. The Zwingli's Confession is not mentioned, nor is any mention made of Calvinism. And Calvinist positions, Calvinism was making inroads within the empire, and increasingly so at this time. And some of this lack of toleration of even other Protestants. Now we forget about the Anabaptists because they're uniformly seen as heretical. The radicals were seen as heretical. Just the magisterials were acceptable. This problem eventually kind of led to what's been known as the 30 Years' War in 1618 to 1648. That too is beyond, that's pointing to later developments beyond the scope of this course, even though just reaching up to the cusp of it. But that's kind of, this is the seed bed is already being formed for the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Augsburg. So we call it a peace. But what does that mean? It was more of a peace than was the interim. Because at least there was agreement. You stay in your room, I'll stay in my room, we'll be fine. That was the peace. So, what do we do about it all? The end of Christendom. That's really what the Peace of Augsburg marks. It may still have been there. I mean, we may still talk about the concepts of Christendom as one unitary entity, but by the Peace of Augsburg is, that's recognizing that it is not that we have failed. The failure was profound for Charles V because this ending of Christendom was ending of this ideal. He didn't know what to make of it. What do you do? What do you do? You don't have another ideal to replace it. He goes to a monastery. It was also problematic, even if not always recognized as such, but by some, for the Protestants, because it also signified the failure of the Protestants to reform the church. Their idea, to begin, was to, I don't want to just say make things better, I don't want to say just reform, but to effect a reformation for the entire church. The term Catholic, I'll be talking about more about this in the next lecture. The term Catholic had always been used. Catholic just meant, and always had meant, universal. So the Catholic Church was always the universal church. And with the emergence of Christendom in the medieval West, is seen as Christendom. We can't talk about Roman Catholicism. We can't talk about Catholicism as distinct from Christianity in any way, shape, or form, even though I still get students in my Western Civ courses who ask that question, saying, okay, medieval Europe may have been Catholic, but when did it become Christian? That historically is not possible. Theologically, we could say, okay, we could discuss that issue theologically, but not historically. But the process of the 16th century, what was going on and happening, and with the Peace of Augsburg, it symbolized not only Charles's failure to continue Christendom, to preserve Christendom as the Christian emperor, it also signified the Protestants' failure to effect a reformation for the Catholic Church. Now what we have is increasing denominalization. So I'll say more about that later. Next lecture. Factionalization. When I talked about earlier on the crumbling of Christendom in the later Middle Ages, this marks its end. And as Humpty Dumpty, once it's fallen off the wall, it cannot be put back together again. That was the importance of the Peace of Augsburg. We'll talk more about the Catholic side of things next lecture, as we're getting very close to the wrapping things up as a whole in terms of the Reformation in early modern Europe and the extent to which the developments and events that I've been talking about, that we've been looking about, and some of the documents that you've been reading comprise a revolution or not. Thank you very much.